We are thinking of our AIA friends and colleagues in the path of Hurricane Laura, and we hope that all are safe and out of harm's way. Today we gather for our third webinar in the AIA series, Critical Conversations on Race, Teaching in Antiquity, which is sponsored by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the AIA. The recordings of the first two webinars, the first one on decolonizing syllabi in the Archaeology and History of the Mediterranean region, and the second, Teaching Race and Material Culture in the Ancient Mediterranean, are available on the AIA website. To quote a recent post on the dangers of performative DEI by the University of Michigan postdoctoral fellow, Paulette Vincent-Ruth, quote, "Equity and justice are not a matter of opinion. They are a moral imperative. A true commitment to DEI is centering those principles in every decision and as the core values of any collaboration or organization," end quote. The DEI committee and the AIA leadership envision these webinars as the beginning of a long and ongoing process of self-reflection on the road to the centering of these principles and in the quest of becoming better accomplices. We want to thank the AIA for their support of this webinar series, and in particular, we'd like to thank Kevin Mullen for his logistical, technological, and Zoom support. We'd be lost without him. Well, I'd be lost without him. My name is Moray Kursel, and I, along with my friend and colleague, Makal Grados, will provide a short introduction, and then we're going to serve as the moderators for today's webinar. I'm an archaeologist, and I teach in the anthropology department at DePaul University in Chicago. I'm also the director of the Interdisciplinary Museum Studies minor. DePaul is the largest Catholic university in the United States. Of the over 20,000 students, 60% come from Illinois, and about 40% are students of color. A third of the students are first generation, as am I, and here we're defining first generation as the first people in the family to attend university. And 40% are transfer students, many of whom come from the city colleges of Chicago. The combination of these amazing students and a city filled with museums and cultural heritage resources makes for an excellent environment in which to teach. So today we're joined by Sanchita Balachandran, Elizabeth Marlowe, and Alex Nagel to discuss becoming better accomplices and instructors, justice, activism, and reflexivity in teaching museums and cultural heritage. Each of us is a member and an active participant in the committees, meetings, and programs of the Archaeological Institute of America. We are also committed to the call for accomplices, which was issued by the Society for Black Archaeologists. During the June SBA webinar, sponsored webinar, Archaeology in the Times of Black Lives Matter, panelists advocated for accomplices over allies. This moment needs people to act, to speak up, to support colleagues, and to make change. I acknowledge that it's on me, a white woman of a certain age, to take on the responsibility of challenging the archaeological, museum, and cultural heritage canons, addressing injustice, changing the narratives in the classes I teach. But I cannot and do not do this alone. I rely heavily on my students, my friends, colleagues, and other accomplices for insights, for wisdom, and advice. I rely on them to tell me when I make mistakes, when I do harm, when I need to do better, and when I need to step back. I also rely on them to let me know when and if I've made a difference. To be honest, I'd be nowhere without the Twitter sphere. It is there I learn, engage, and understand better how to be an accomplice. And I'm indebted to the tweets of Laura Heath Stout, April Bisa, Steph Helmhofer, Paulette Steves, Robin Nelson, Sarah Bond, Michael Rivera, Heba Abu El Gawad, Jade Ryerson, Quinn Tessman, Catherine Blouin, Christina Riggs, Alice Stevenson, Roberta Maza, Keisha Supernant, Alice Proctor, Usama Gad, Rachel Mayers, Girish Deshwani, Amara Thornton, Alice Stevenson, Michael Press, and Subhadra Das. The various folks from Museum Detox, Everyday Orientalism, and Mike Murawski and Latanya Autry from Museums Are Not Neutral are invaluable colleagues. Dr. Autry's Art Stuff Matters and Social Justice in Museums resource list are fundamental to rethinking and retooling how I work and teach in cultural heritage and museums. You should also be following Dr. Robin Mitchell and art activist Barbie for great outfits, good shoes, and excellent content. This list of tweeters is far from complete, and I know I've left people off who inspire and help me every single day. For me, teaching is one big group project, and today we have together some of the most inspiring and innovative teachers from whom I've learned much. This is an ongoing process, and I hope that we share strategies, discuss successes and failures, and we all leave with some action items to implement in our teaching, research, and community engagement. But a word of warning. At the end of this, there will be no magic checklist where you can tick boxes and think, there, I've decolonized. It is an ongoing and constant process. And if you're serious about being a good accomplice, you will always be reviewing, tweaking, changing, reading, tweeting, and learning, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable. It's going to be a lot of work, but we are all in this together. So I'm going to turn it over now to Makal, who will give us some more introductory remarks.
Hi, I'm Makal Grados, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Interdepartmental Program in Classical Art and Archaeology at the University of Michigan. Personally, I'm interested in the material culture of Hellenistic and Roman Northwest Greece and Southwest Albania, as well as the role of archaeology in communities outside of academia, mainly through public scholarship. A good place to start in dismantling and acknowledging the settler colonial legacies where we live is with an acknowledgement of the ongoing systemic injustices in the places where we teach and live. So with that in mind, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the University of Michigan is situated is the traditional territory of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. The 1817 Treaty of the Maumee Rapids, or Fort Meigs, allowed for the foundation of a university in the Detroit area, with the agreement that the youth of these nations be educated there as well. The terms of this treaty were not fulfilled. In 1837, the land was sold when the university was relocated to Ann Arbor, and the proceeds went directly to the permanent endowment of the University of Michigan. No members of these nations attended the university for at least 130 years. I recognize the lasting consequences of the continuous effects of colonization, colonial violence, and struggle for recognition of indigenous sovereignty, and I recognize the use of this land that has led to a level of financial security of an institution that has historically excluded and marginalized the nations from whom it got its land. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion that I, as a member of this institution, must practice to recognize the responsibility and commitment I have to reflect on how I've benefited from this trauma and to advocate for marginalized and excluded groups. I would also like to acknowledge that I currently reside on the traditional territory of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and Sioux nations. Though this land was retained by these nations in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851, the treaty was broken almost immediately, and in 1858, the federal government began to allow prospectors of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush to colonize it. The 1861 Treaty of Fort Wise, signed by a minority of Cheyenne representatives, ceded this land to the federal government, and its unpopularity led to the Colorado War and the Sand Creek Massacre. I again recognize the violent and traumatic consequences of the actions that have led to my occupation of this land today and commit to being accomplice in the struggle for recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. Writing these acknowledgements was a learning process for me, and I'm open to the correction and continued learning. With the idea of being self-reflexive and self-reflective, we'd like you to consider on which Indigenous homelands you're currently situated and the histories of their colonial interventions. I'll be posting a link in the Q&A for a resource that you can add your zip code or a number you can send a text to that will give you information on the original inhabitants of this land. Just some nuts and bolts. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the AIA website soon after the session, along with any resources that are mentioned during the session. Links will also be posted in the Q&A as they come up, but feel free to ask for any. And please note that the chat is disabled, so direct your questions to the Q&A. And one final note, if you're live tweeting, please use the hashtag AIADEI. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Elizabeth Marlowe.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for getting this started, Morrigan McCall. I'm coming to you from Colgate University, which sits on Oneida land. And what I want to talk about today is a little bit of my own journey toward becoming a better accomplice and a more reflexive teacher, a journey that is still very much ongoing. And I want to start by talking about the Panopticon. As many of you probably know, this is a model prison that was theorized in Britain in the 18th century and actually built in a number of places around the world. And McCall, I asked McCall to put in a link. Good, so if you can all, if you'd like to click on the link that should be popping up now, you can actually look at an image of a real Panopticon. So that you don't have to just look at my face this whole time. So the structure of a Panopticon is a round building with cells around the perimeter. It's a prison structure, right? With the cells around the perimeter and the guard tower in the center. And the point of the Panopticon, right, this all-seeing structure, Panopticon, is that surveillance is total, and that the power imbalance is 100 to 0, where the guards can see everything in the center, right? They have the lights shining out into the cells, and the prisoners can't see anything. They can't see into the guard tower because of the light that is shining out into their faces. So they can't even tell when they are being watched. They have to assume that they are always being watched. The metaphor of a panopticon has been used in many different contexts to describe museums, especially universal survey museums, right? And that's a genre that, or a label that some of these institutions like to use to describe themselves, right? Universal surveillance. Institutions like the Louvre, the Hermitage, the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. These museums claim for themselves the right to survey all other cultures. And they hold all the cards, right? They hold the objects, they hold the power to speak, and those whom they are surveying don't have that right to speak. They don't have that right to self-determination. They are effectively represented by these mute specimens. And then the museum itself writes the labels, right? So the labels are written by the guards, in a sense. And in a way, you can think about these kinds of universal museums, these universal survey museums, as essentially putting on display. The museum itself is a display of one culture's power. Oh, my light has just gone out of my office. There we go. The museum itself is a display of one culture's power to survey everyone else. So this theory, the museum as panopticon, has been talked about a lot by critical museum theorists. Scholars like Tony Bennett has a very famous article called The Exhibitionary Complex that develops this. Foucault picks this up, of course. But it's rarely used, I think, or it hasn't been used often enough for academics to theorize what we are doing in the classroom, especially in our survey classes. And I myself am very much a product of that model of teaching. I was trained as an art historian in a very traditional program at Columbia. And many aspects of my work in recent years have been forms of pushing back against aspects of my own training. I started my art history career as an undergraduate with a year-long survey course, right, which I loved. And you know, the reasons why I love that are sort of all the reasons why I'm now trying to push back against it. I loved the master narrative. It was so nice to be able to put sort of the whole world on a timeline, right? I never really thought critically about what was happening in those places outside of the spot where they showed up on that timeline. And then when I started my first job, I inherited a course called The Survey of Western Art to 1400. And there's lots of ways to start thinking about how to dismantle the ideological structures that are embedded in a course like that. If you were following the news or reading any of those great Twitter links that Morag gave us at the beginning of the hour, you may know that the art history department at Yale was recently in the news for scrapping their version of the survey course entirely and replacing it with a number of smaller thematic introductory courses such as Sacred Places and the Silk Road. And it, that this move that they made brought out neocons from all across the country who were berating Yale for giving up this kind of bastion of traditional art historical knowledge. What Yale did was bold and great, but there's also other ways you can do this kind of work, especially if you aren't in a position to revise your entire departmental curriculum, right? That's a larger undertaking. So what I want to talk about a little bit are some of the things that I have done in recent years in my own teaching to try to chip away at that course that I inherited, that Survey of Western Art to 1400. And I would say that the most important move for me has been to think about how to foreground the fact in my classroom that this is a constructed canon, and that by studying it in this class, we are learning as much about the modern world as we are learning about the ancient world. So what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? For the first thing I think that has been really valuable for me has been to ditch the pretense that I'm offering my students any kind of complete picture of the truth of ancient reality, because I'm not, right? So I've given up the word survey, which implies a kind of completeness or totality. It also implies a kind of neutral, objective view of some like actual reality that is out there. These are things that I don't believe in. I've given up the use of any single textbook, and there's good and bad textbooks out there, but the problem with all of them across the board is that they all present a single monolithic voice, right? And by their very structure, they present a kind of master narrative, a kind of coherence, a teleology, that I think we need to be troubling rather than reifying in the form of a textbook. The other thing I do, as I mentioned a moment ago, is to try to really thematize the fact that this is a constructed canon. And what that means is that for every work I teach how that object ended up in the canon. And I treat that as much a part of the object's history as its ancient history, right? So when it was discovered and what was said about it at the time, this very often leads me into discussions of larger colonial contexts, how these objects end up in the museums that they're in today, if it's famous because of who owned it or because of who excavated it, or because of a debate about its meaning or what was said about it at the moment of its discovery, or a repatriation claim, or because Mussolini appropriated it, or because it was very influential on US architects. These are all parts of the object biography, right? The long, continuous, ongoing history of these objects that I make very much as much a part of what I'm teaching as what this portrait had originally meant in the Augustan era, or why the Parthenon was built. I also, as often as I can, I try to show pictures of the object not against a neutral black or gray background, right? Those kind of traditional art historical photographs where the object exists outside of any real time or place, but rather to show the object in its larger museum setting, and talk a bit about how the framing in the museum keeps the object famous, right? If it's located at the end of a long corridor or on axis with a doorway, if there's a bench in front of it, if there's a large crowd in front of it, right? These are all ways in which museums continue to construct the value of particular objects. So in other words, I'm teaching not just the objects, but the object biography, and by extension, I'm also trying to teach the institutions of our discipline. And among those institutions, I would count things like colonial exploration, classicism, the classical tradition in architecture, in schooling, big digs, the art market, cultural heritage laws. One thing I do want to stress here, a really big implication of this is the willingness, and this is something that took me a while, but the willingness to teach fewer and fewer objects. Every time I teach my survey class, I'm teaching fewer, oh, there's my timer. Okay, I'll wrap it up in 1 second. I'm teaching fewer and fewer objects each day, right? At this point, I'm really down to 1 or at most 2 objects per lecture. And find myself saying, right, how can I leave out, I can't teach this class and leave out this object. And then when I find myself feeling that, I try to say to myself, no, I'm feeling that way because of the canon, right? I am as much a kind of victim of the canon if I feel like I can't ditch a particular object. So as I said, this is an ongoing struggle. And I will stop there and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on these issues. And now I'm supposed to introduce our next speaker. Sorry, Morag, I'm blanking. Sanchita's coming after me, is that right? Yes, okay, so Sanchita, please take it away.
Can you see my screen? Okay, great. Thanks to Morag and McCall for the invitation to be part of this panel, and to my co-panelists, Elizabeth and Alex, and to the AIA for supporting this conversation. For those of you who may not be able to hear me, the full text of my talk is available at this URL, and it's the same Google Doc that's already been shared in case you weren't aware that the permissions have been taken off of that. So my name is Sanchita Balachandran. You may be hearing my voice, but I'm sorry that I cannot be on camera as I have the flu and feel pretty awful right now. For those who may not be able to see my profile picture, in happier days, I show an image of myself, a brown-skinned woman of South Asian descent with shoulder-length curly black hair standing against the pink flowering trees that grow in my neighborhood in a place now called Baltimore, but that is the ancestral homeland of the Susquehannock people. I also acknowledge the presence of the Piscataway, the Accahannocks, the Nanticokes, the Lumbees, and the Cherokees. And I want to thank Peggy Maynor of the Multicultural Initiative for Community Advancement for helping me begin the work of learning the indigenous histories of this place I now call home. I'm a conservator of archaeological materials and associate director of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum. My archaeological fieldwork experience and the conservation work, teaching, and research I do with museum collections has primarily focused on material from the ancient Mediterranean region. At Johns Hopkins, I teach courses in the Interdisciplinary Museums and Society program, working with undergraduate students across numerous majors. I'm grateful for tremendous freedom in what I teach, from ancient technology-focused courses such as examining archaeological objects to museological ones such as collections management practicum and critical issues in art conservation, to courses that focus on topics such as ancient color or even specific objects, including Roman Egyptian mummy portraits. And the Google Doc has all the links to these syllabi. My teaching centers the care and use of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum's collection, and each year up to 1,000 students have some kind of in-person contact with museum objects. For today's conversation, I'd like to raise 3 concerns about how we might teach differently. Model interdisciplinarity as a more diverse approach to studying the past. As a conservator, my work has always been relied on being in conversation with people across disciplines, including archaeology, art history, material science, chemistry, and contemporary art making, to name a few. Doing this kind of interdisciplinary work requires, above all, a genuine sense of curiosity about what people in other fields have to say about the same topics and objects we claim to know best, and a willingness to learn and develop mutually agreed upon language for sharing and debating information. Modeling such interdisciplinarity in the context of an undergraduate class is invaluable because students have to work at understanding different kinds of methodologies, data sets, and perspectives. They have to struggle with teasing out the kinds of arguments being made, and they have to find a way to integrate sometimes even contradictory information, just as any of us do with our own research. For the course Recreating Ancient Greek Ceramics, which I co-taught with potter Matthew Heilich, 13 undergraduates across majors, then classics graduate student Ross Brendel and Potter Camilla Asher spent a semester understanding Athenian red figure vases from the perspective of art historians, classicists, material scientists, and conservators, while also studying ancient vases in the museum collection, all while producing replicas in our custom-built kiln. We also made a short film, Mysteries of the Kylics, and maintained a class blog. It was a challenging, intense experience, but it also raised otherwise unknowable insights about what ceramics production in ancient Athens might have been like. And it also gave us an embodied understanding of these objects that otherwise just sit on shelves. I would argue that this is why many of us teach, to develop our students' capacities for discernment and to be honest about what they don't or can't know, to give them tools to evaluate and integrate diverse forms of evidence, to challenge them to ask new questions through the process of struggling with things that don't quite fit together. Teach with actual objects. I think instructors have a lot of different reasons for not teaching with objects. It's logistically complicated, it takes time out of lectures. Objects without archaeological context are not, quote, scientific evidence. But not teaching with objects is a dereliction of our duty. We should be training students to look critically and patiently at real things, because that is an essential skill for those staying in archaeology, art history, classics, and allied fields. Every course I teach utilizes the Archaeological Museum collection, and it is truly a joy to see students hold ancient objects in their hands for the very first time. There's a sense of electricity to that moment of connection between them and the people of the past who once held or made these things or were buried with them. Working with objects comes with its own set of protocols. First, context. These are ancient people's things, and we owe our respect and care to these people. And we must be aware that the colonial and extractive practices of museum building have removed many of these items from people's graves. Second, mindset. A real object requires our curiosity, patience, and willingness to be confused by what we see. Art history and archaeology students in particular come in believing that the objects we study should somehow hew closely to the descriptions they have read of them in textbooks. But real things are evidence of real people's interactions with them. They are messy. Third, participatory learning. My courses often involve utilizing technical tools such as multiband imaging and X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy to study objects. I am always position myself as a co-learner with my students, emphasizing how I myself don't know what we'll find out about things we're about to examine, and this makes for a more engaged and collaborative learning process. Changing a single syllabus does too little if the class culture, the departmental culture, our institutions, and our disciplines do not change. Let's step back and ask why we're having this series of conversations about changing how we teach. Perhaps the hope is that rewriting our syllabi gives us the chance of some literal course correction. But changing a single course does too little to change the way our larger spaces operate, because students who leave your class feeling more engaged and maybe even seen still have to return to a department, an institution, and a discipline that may not value them. I can only speak from my position as a cisgendered, able-bodied brown woman, but diversifying our fields means recognizing all the ways in which Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, are kept out at every level, and how this discrimination is multiplicative if they identify as LGBTQAI+ or have visible or invisible disabilities. Exclusion works in so many ways. Never seeing a Black archaeologist in a children's book, as was recently mentioned in a panel of the Society of Black Archaeologists, not having enough money to complete a field school requirement for archaeology degree, being seen as needing, quote, accommodations for not coming into graduate school with all the requisite, quote, classical languages that their more elite peers might have learned in high school. At every stage, there's an emphasis on the, quote unquote, deficiencies of people who don't fit the white norm, rather than what they bring to the conversation and the field. As the only woman of color teaching in these fields at my institution, and who has seen many BIPOC students in my office over the last decade, I have seen the harm that these forms of gatekeeping and ritual exclusion have on students of color. Our fields do not have a diversity problem. They have a habitability problem. Perhaps some of you are thinking, but these are hard fields. You really need to want to be here. In my experience, there are two reasons why students, undergraduate or graduate, do not stay in our fields. One is extreme financial hardship, and 2, the constant microaggressions, hazing, exclusionary practices, and blatant racism that makes their own survival and thriving impossible. So the question is, what are we willing to do that doesn't just serve our own interests as instructors, because otherwise inclusion is just another useless word. Thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen and pass this on to Alex.
Yes, first of all, thank you so very much also Morag for organizing this and everyone for being here. So it's a great honor to be an accomplice on this panel. So I would also like to acknowledge first of all where I am right now. This is in Manhattan. So here you see brick walls behind me. So Manhattan, the original place here, as it was called by the Lenape, who were the original people living here. The Hudson River is only 1 block from me. So I'm here based in New York City and in Washington, D.C., where I have an office in the National Museum of Natural History. I want to make a short disclaimer that my opinion is not the opinion, of course, of these institutions that I work with. So here at FIT in New York City, I'm an assistant professor in the art history department, teaching on the ancient world, and in Washington, D.C., I'm a research associate with the anthropology department, so bringing also different traditions and disciplines together here. So both institutions, the FIT, Fashion Institute of Technologies, is known for its unconventional minds. The Smithsonian is sometimes not so unconventional, I would say. So, but this is maybe for another discussion. Behind me also you see actually Persepolis. This is a site where I work in Iran, where I'm really privileged also to be able to go even under these strange relationships that this country has with Iran. So here is, I'm proud also to serve in 2 institutions actually who are being led by people who have already over these last decades had reached went through this channel. So Dr. Joyce Brown, who's the FIT president since 1998, person of color, and Dr. Lonnie Bunch here at the Smithsonian secretary. So both of them are role models really that I always also introduce my students to as they are cheering up for the students. I also learn from my students, of course. So here we have an exhibition, Black in Time, at the FIT Art and Design Gallery that was just held in January, organized by the Black Student Union we have here in Manhattan. So student unions are always important for every professor to be engaged with. This exhibition, which featured also famous ancient African queens in it. So it was a wonderful introduction. So I brought my students regularly to this one. We have now just on the summer, earlier students here at FIT also produced a graffiti series called Chalk That Talk, where also issues that were particularly important in these last couple of months were featured. So Justice for Breonna Taylor, and you see the little tweets here of the students. They have their hashtag for their Instagram accounts also, and they're so making sure to share this here with each other. So these kids inspire me. I've been inspired by my professors. Here I'm actually with my professor, Margaret Cool-Root at the University of Michigan, where we went on a demonstration back in 2018 in Washington, D.C., where we were protesting the violence here in this country. And we have here in New York City actually quite a number also of interesting stories, narratives that can bring the struggle, the challenges also that we're overcoming with the people here. I think in the chat also there's, Masha, I think had shared also about New York City. There are fantastic websites here. If you want to learn about New York City archaeology, about the Seneca village, which is a very important ground here in what is now Central Park, where the settlers were just really removed there in the 19th century to make room for this project here. And some of the people who are here in New York City always featured in my classes are person, people like Bella de Costa Green, who was the first librarian of the Morgan Library and the first director also. I would really recommend actually for anyone teaching in New York City to use the resources here, the archive also of the Morgan Library, in learning more about this particular woman of color who made it also pretty far in her career trajectory. The books here also, Diversity, Equity, Accessibility and Inclusion in Museums, I can recommend, came out in 2019 and has a lot of articles on Black women curators and the trajectories also of Lonnie Bunch and so on. This is a very inspiring book that I find useful for my classes. And the Routledge Companion for African American Art History, which just came out, and there's also really interesting articles in this. So what I'm teaching here at FIT is courses on cities and civilizations, the Eastern Mediterranean world. It's actually written in the description from non-Western perspectives. So this is already, the colleagues before me who were starting with this class had this little snippet in there. I brought a new course here to FIT. It's called Earth Matters, Art and Environment in Ancient Egypt and Western Asia, where we talk about how ancient societies dealt with rivers, with forests, trees, and how all of these materials had their own vibrant matter with them. So I teach a course on art in New York, a course on museum professions and administration, course on museum exhibitions, and one on art and ethics. And I'm happy to go more into this in the discussion. So I just want to acknowledge also the AIA. I'm very honored to be on this panel, but it's one of the most colonial organizations that I have actually encountered since moving to the United States. So while we had in January now an AIA meeting in Washington, DC, at the same time that the government threatened sites in Iran, the country where I work also. So I was one of the very few really who went out to these demonstrations there in front of the White House. I was standing there and just to raise awareness about the more than 3.1 million people who already have suffered since this invasion. And I think that archaeologists in some parts are also a part of this. So this is what I'm sharing with my students. And Morag, I'm sorry I have to share this here. This is from fantastic blog by Morag, actually Follow the Pots. So I just want to shout out here also for those of you who are on this social media channel. I posted something there in January. I think it is worth considering where such a list of bombing targets came from. I read a tweet by one of my favorite writers, Ron Rosenbaum, suggesting that any Pentagon archaeologist generating a list targeting Iranian cultural heritage sites should be identified by the House and tried in The Hague for war crimes. I found this actually a very interesting quote. Once I posted it, I was accused of being a liberal twit. So I posted also the comment here by this archaeologist. I blacked out the name here. So you stupid liberal twits, and I'm not going to repeat the name of this person, is not going to bomb any cultural sites. ISIS will and has, bitch at them. So this was the comment that I received there for just standing up basically against what's currently going on here among many others demonstrating. Here in New York City, I have met with Brooklyn for Peace, a fantastic team here that I already also invited to my classes this semester. And here are a few books also that I would like to acknowledge that I have used in my courses. I usually have poets, also poems I think are part of cultural heritage. And so when it's about Greece, for instance, you should make sense, obviously, also of Kavafis. I mean, he's the one who brought Greek classics and Greek archaeology also in the Greek mindset here. But those here are more from the modern times. So Salma Sharif, whom you see on the upper right, fantastic author living here in America, has published a book called Look, from which we read poems. And I got a grant actually with a colleague of mine here from another department to invite Salma Sharif also. Laura Nader, who I can recommend as an anthropologist for her work on what the rest think of the West from 600 AD. And I think so this is not poetry, obviously, but it is actually in some way. So, I mean, there are some words also, written in a style that it makes you thinking. And I want to give out also a shout out here, by the way, for the previous AIA webinars for, I think it was Dr. Catherine Bloom, who made the Braiding Sweetgrass book a recommendation. And since she gave this recommendation about 2 weeks ago, I'm so much into this book. So this is now on my list for my students here also. The other authors that I have listed here, David Larson has a book, poetry book, Names of the Lion, which brings together from an older translation, actually over 300 terms how the lion was named in the ancient world. And it gets the students also thinking a little bit about the names that we are using. And when we discuss things like cultural heritage here, this is very a term that is used here in America, but is it really the same when we talk with someone over in Iraq and Iran and Yemen? So there are quite a number really of authors here on this who I can recommend for the fun of it. Also on the lower center, you see Karl Szabo, who is also on Twitter, bringing a bit of the fun content into Western Asian cultures, what's happening there really at the moment. So advice, always surround yourself with those on the mission, on the same mission as you are. So here are also a few of those who I follow on Twitter, on other social media channels. So here also shout out again, people like Mehia, Kathe, Michael Press, who was already mentioned. I'm learning from them, and I invited also Michael Press. He was speaking to my students last semester. Monica and Heba will come this semester also. So because here in New York City also the situation that the museums have now so limited accessibility, it's the time now on webinar actually to invite all of these colleagues and have them talk about Egypt and the heritage in about 15 minutes. So that's why I also agree with Morag that social media is a fantastic way to reach out to all of these colleagues. As I mentioned here at FIT, I'm working with other departments. So the Department of English and Communication, shout out to my colleague Amy Lemon, with whom I did a project called Fine Lines, where we had Yannis Amilakis last year with us, who spoke also at an event where we had a poet and we had a student of us who is actually himself who his own father was taken by ICE. So, I mean, we have stories here at the campus really among our students that are important to share. And I forgot to mention this actually. So my students here, we have about still 40% white students. We have about 12% Latinx students. We have about 10% African-American students. Mostly are here from locally New York in the area. We have also about 12% international students every year. So my own project, actually, which I always introduce the students to, is about—
Alex, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, sure, just my airport here. So how get all of these objects from Yemen to America? So this is something that I introduce my students every semester. I have a colleague who spoke at FIT, also from Yemen, Sama Al-Hamdani, who said about, in some ways, the archaeologists also here in the US, you can't be the destroyer and savior at the same time. So this is, I think, a good quote that my students actually can often work with me. So I was also last December again back in the Gulf of Aden I speak often with the Iraqi colleagues here in the embassy in Washington, DC. We had a repatriation ceremony that I was attending, and we had students also from us involved. So I brought in someone from the embassy here to speak to my students. And finally, also just there's also a link in the Google document to an exhibition that I curated with students in 2017 in Washington, DC, where we featured on mostly Mesopotamian scholars who really have been here in the US also since the 19th century. Some of them brought artifacts also with them. So we discussed how these materials ended here in Washington, DC in the Smithsonian Institution and other institutions, just to get also an idea really about how materials move. And I did another event, so on Washington, DC in 10,000 years from now. This was in 2014 in a collaboration with the only city archaeologists in DC. Students here need to learn how very few resources are here also about archaeology actually in these areas, where we had looked back 10,000 years in the past in Washington, DC and 10,000 years in the future. Our students would envision this. So this is just a tip. Also maybe play a little bit here with the past and future ideas in your own classes that you are teaching. Thank you.
Thanks very much, thanks to everyone for those really interesting and inspiring comments. We have a couple of questions, and both of these questions and what Alex ended up, how he ended, and the comments that both Liz and Sanchita made, we are all what I think Sanchita referred to us as in-betweeners, right? So we are people who may not be traditional archaeologists, but also work in heritage and in museums. But one of our commonalities is that we are all using objects. As Sanchita eloquently stated, we have to be using objects. But one of the questions, well, both of them actually from Sarah Arel and Nadira Hill, are about teaching in the time of COVID when you are in a hybrid moment and you don't have access to collections, or if you are at an institution and you are not near any collections, you're more than 90 miles away from anything. So if each of you could address that, that'd be really great. Thanks.
So I actually had to think about this because I was about to teach one of my very hands-on courses this coming semester. And actually, I'm grateful that I have the flexibility to kind of postpone that first semester. But I did kind of work through how I might do something like this in my head. And I think the main thing that I'm trying to teach when it comes to looking at objects is a kind of attunement, right? How do you actually pay attention to a surface for all of the things that a surface or a structure can give you? And being able to do that means you just spend time actually just looking at something. And so again, and kind of thinking through what a COVID version of my course might be, you know, everyone has a ceramic bowl in their house. Everyone probably has like a doorknob or, you know, I mean, things that are in hopefully people's houses that they can have access to. And simply spending time thinking about how those objects were created, how they're put together, how different surfaces look. That's the beginning of being able to look at anything more carefully. And I would say for people who are not close to, you know, an archaeological collection and, you know, whatever quote unquote normal times is, I don't know what the new phrase is. I think there are lots of ways to kind of get around this. One, I would make friends with all of the makers in your community. I've taken my students to bronze casting studios, to ceramic studios, to glass blowing studios. And that is incredible experience for students to see things that they would never otherwise get access to. Now, I should say, if you're going to involve people, you need to pay them. So do not expect them to do this for free, but it's a relatively small amount of money to actually get incredible experience, and your students will absolutely remember that.
Can I just build on something that Sanchita was saying? I haven't done this exercise in my large survey course, but in my smaller upper level classes, I have done an exercise with some success. It didn't work perfectly. I have some ideas about how to do it better next time. But to get students thinking about how we interpret objects, I've done an exercise where all the students brought in an object and then they were paired off and they told their partner about the object that they had brought in. And then their partner, you know, and they talked to each other for like, 15 minutes about their object. And they were supposed to really talk about it and tell stories about it and look at the surface of it together and like really focus. And then their partner had 1 minute to present the object to the class. So the partner had to decide which of the many stories and observations they were going to share with the public. They inevitably got details wrong. They had to be selective. So there were ways in which the exercise sort of mirrored what museum curators do when they choose which stories to tell on a label. And also mirroring the experience of the represented culture that doesn't actually have the power to tell its own story. So that was an interesting exercise, and the students brought the objects in. So, they don't have to be museum level objects. They could be anything that, is sort of special to them, or any object that triggers storytelling.
Yes, for me also. So again, COVID is as sad as it is the time to have guest speakers on the screen. So I want to stress again, so invite even for a short time, 10 minutes only, someone who is from the culture that you are introducing, be it ancient Greece or Egypt. So the other thing for me, I have, when I teach the course Earth Matters, for instance, we have a street tree map here in New York City. So usually students can look what's trees are in their streets and in their neighborhoods. So for this one session, for instance, also we discuss really, they take a photo of their closest tree to them, what they know about the tree, and then we get into the discussion also how in the ancient world trees were honored. And we have so a tree, we have someone from the from the Park Service also speaking to us. We have in this class also a beekeeper, because New York City has over 250 bees here. So, and they were in the ancient times enough use also for bees and in the artworks that they created. So, I mean, we have here ways to engage with the audience. Another idea is really to do this exhibition proposal. So what I do every semester is have 5 objects for one story that the students want to tell. So just to really come up with a good title, come up with a short goal of the exhibition with 2 sponsors at least, and then with 2 event ideas. So this is often towards the end of the semester, we have this presentation now on the screen also, because they will have to present themselves also when they speak to someone in the industry. So it's important really for this time, I stress to my students, learn about the skills also now that you can hear, and for activism, this is the right time, create your own Instagram exhibition. The other thing also, label writing. So I think some of you had these exercises also.
We'll get to label writing. So we'll just, I just want to jump in there and say that I have my students watch episodes of Antiques Roadshow along the same line as what you do with them bringing in objects. And then they also look at the narratives that people create about the things in their attics, and then how they interact with the folks evaluating. So that's also really useful, and you can do anywhere.
Just one more thing, what is important is create a community among the students, not with us so much, but really, this is now in these COVID times, I cannot stress this enough. Make sure that your groups, so I have 27 students in each of my classes, make sure that they really have enough time to engage with each other. It's not so much now about us. I think we can be the safe guardian here, but they do not have the spaces at the university campus, as you know, so they really need these classes to get and engage with each other. That's important.
McCall, are you going to ask the next question? You need to.
Yes, I have to mute myself. So yeah, we have a question too about virtual programming. I think since you always have the perspective of instructors, what kinds of resources do you wish you had access to that museums had for class discussions, or ways that museums could make their online resources more accessible or applicable to your classes?
So if I could speak with my museum person hat on right now, COVID time is really hard for us for lots of reasons, in addition to sort of the normal reasons, because there's a lot of pressure on museums to suddenly make content available and accessible that has never had the kind of attention, time, or resources put towards it to have it ready to go. And I can speak for our institution, which is, you know, we're only 2 staff. And so being able to try and actually support all of the teaching needs of the people who regularly come physically into our space virtually is a huge burden. And to try and do that on, you know, just a simple thing like internet from home, which doesn't even allow you to kind of access your servers and your high quality images, it's really challenging. And, you know, I have to say, as much as I value all of these digital resources, I'm very much, there's no replacement for the in-person contact with the actual thing. And I know that might sound, you know, truly elitist, and frankly, so much of my work is about trying to reduce the number of barriers to getting access to real things for for everyone. But there's something that happens with a real object that you simply cannot replicate with pictures. And I really hope that we're not in this situation that much longer, and we're all trying to sort of do stopgap measures to make this happen. But you know, be aware that your teaching needs also means someone else is actually putting in a lot of work to try and make that material accessible. And it's exhausting and it's hard when I think a lot of our institutions have assumed that, you know, if something's digital, it's easy to do. It doesn't take any time. It doesn't take, you know, infrastructure, and it just all sort of magically happens. And that's just not the case. And if I could, I just wanted to kind of answer Dane Clark's question. Hi, Dane, from my class on recreating ancient Greek ceramics. Replicas to me in COVID times could be kind of an interesting approach. I personally feel that replicas are incredibly, you know, powerful ways to understand the materials or some nature of the materials that ancient people were working with. It also gives you a very embodied experience of those objects in a way that just reading about them and seeing pictures of them cannot. And it takes you out of your head. I feel like a lot of our students are they're so kind of mentally exhausted by feeling like they need to know everything. And when you actually have them do something physical, it kind of, you know, takes away some of that pressure, and it actually opens up other ways to kind of think about how real people lived. So I think it's incredibly valuable. Whether it would ever be a replacement for the original, I mean, first of all, that's a huge legal problem, and, you know, other things, but I would hope that we would become more open to thinking about how recreating and replicating materials just opens up different ways of scholarship.
Just one comment also, because we had one exercise last semester also with the British Museum and the museums in Greece, because it's easy actually to find on Instagram all of these, the National Museum in Athens, for instance, just to give a case study, to look at how many followers they have on Instagram, to look and compare here also about how museums present stories here. So I mean, just use this also as a tool for students just to compare really, because we work in these Eastern Mediterranean areas. So you just contrast here also a little bit what stories are presented here and what stories are presented in the other world. So I mean, luckily, for instance, some museums have plenty of description available. There are others not so much, but the way to present these also now in this medium, I think is something where students should more pay more attention to.
Liz, did you want to add anything? Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, well, the discussion or the question of whose voices, right, are heard and whose stories are told is kind of a nice segue into the next question on what are your thoughts or experiences regarding how to present issues of cultural heritage, colonialism, or underrepresented voices in the particular space of an art museum as opposed to an archaeology museum, where there might be more pressure to focus on aesthetics, connoisseurship, in lieu of context, ancient cultures, and cultural heritage?
Yeah, I think you wrote a whole book on that, so you can go.
This is a really important question, and it's an issue I grapple with all the time and have grappled with in many different contexts, including a year in which I was nominally directing our campus art museum. I think it is essential to dismantle those the barriers that those terms put up. The notion that we only need to be talking about aesthetics in an art museum, that context only matters in an anthropology museum, that human beings are specimens in a natural history museum. These are all inherited paradigms that are deeply embedded in colonialist ways of knowing. And the more we can trouble those expectations, the more we can do to try to overcome any number of legacies that we've inherited from the colonial era. So I don't ignore aesthetics. I think paying attention to the formal choices that were made by artists or that were made by makers is an essential component to understanding how objects were meaningful, how they communicated in their original cultures. I think the term aesthetics might be what trips us up sometimes. We think that if we're talking about the way an object looks, then we're talking about aesthetics. And I think that's maybe where some of these false binaries can appear. The way things look matters when you're talking about a material object, whether that's an object in an art museum or an anthropological museum, in the same way that context matters, whether you're talking about an object in an art museum. And if we don't have the object, that opens up, or sorry, if we don't have the context, that opens up whole other ways of thinking about objects. It is not the case that an archaeological object with an unknown provenance is a meaningless object. It just means that it is meaningful in a different set of discourses, right? A set of discourses having to do with the modern construction of meaning. So your question is a really important one, but I would start by saying, like, you know, get rid of all of the assumptions that are built into those terms.
I would actually say forget this question. So, I mean, for anyone who's working in these countries, there is not such a difference of an art museum and an archaeological museum. If you go today to, let's say, Greece, Turkey, or so, I mean, the history there of these museum institutions also is something we need to include, obviously, in our curriculum. So there's a wonderful article by Christina Krebs. Also, there's a link also on, museums in the non-Western context, it's called. So the question, forget about this question. I think there is no such a difference really, and there shouldn't also be. I think we shouldn't end up in these discussions. It's my personal opinion of is there a difference between an art and archaeology museum? I'm not aware of this really in these areas where I work.
So one of the things that I typically do is I try to be really transparent about the history of our own collection, and pretty much in every course I teach, I assign a description or a catalog description from one of the people who donated things to our collection, usually in the late 1800s or early 1900s, describing, you know, what they thought of the objects at the moment of acquisition or deposition with us. And I think we are the ones having this problem. You know, at our career stages, undergraduate students don't have these concerns. They can quite quickly, you know, literally kind of read these descriptions and say, well, what made this person think that he could just go and buy human beings? Well, why is this here? You know, they will ask you this quite directly. And I think those are exactly the kind of conversations we need to be willing to engage in, because if we don't, we're really just perpetuating the ongoing colonial legacy of museum building, right? I mean, I think we just have to be transparent about it. And I think what has been really interesting is, you know, last semester, for example, I taught a course where we were looking at a recently acquired collection that was actually donated to us from another museum, the Asian Art Museum, by Avery Brundage, whose bust has now been removed from the front of the Asian Art Museum because of his, you know, anti-Semitic, racist, misogynist views, which we already knew because the students were researching Avery Brundage and saying, wow, he's pretty terrible. And so, you know, when I forwarded the link, you know, saying that this bust had been removed, I mean, none of them was surprised. A couple of them were kind of like, well, finally. So I think we need to give our students much more credit for seeing through all of these completely constructed, you know, narratives that we've made up. I mean, I often tell them, you know, we're living in the Matrix. And of course, most of them were born after the Matrix movie came out. So that makes me really sad. But I mean, all of these things are made up, and one only needs to read Black feminist literature, indigenous literature, and you can see just how constructed these concepts are for how we function, and we don't need to perpetuate it.
I want to return to the question of labels and using curatorial moments in our classes. And someone just posted a question, can curators be a resource for your classes? And so this could be part of this. And I've had great success in just cold calling or cold emailing curators all over the world / country, and people are willing to either Zoom in or come to the class. But what I wanted to ask was, how do you carry out these curatorial projects or rewrite these traditional narratives or labels? And I will just, in the interest of full disclosure, say that Liz and I spent a week in London visiting many museums discussing labels, and that's what we did in addition to attending the tag meetings. That's what we did for a week in London. So we've spent a lot of time talking about labels, but how do you engage your class in thinking about labels?
Can I start? So, okay, so I have an assignment also every class, so to give them a label from the Metropolitan Museum, and they have to come up with a 125-word version of this label. The one example that we always use is there's a Hadrian head. I mean, I think Liz knows this head probably much better, with a description about being his gayish look or something on the label. So I mean, the students and I, we read this aloud also, and then we just wonder who came up with such a label description. And the sentences also are just, they are meandering and so on. So at the end, you do not know actually who is there or what is this, what is depicted there. So the assignment really to give this label to a student, then they see it's not necessary to add a description that the mouth is looking in a certain way. Particular for this is not needed, because you see this already. So you do not need to repeat, in my opinion, at least in my students, and I discussed this also in these classes, you do not need to repeat what's already there. So I mean, just give us other information that is more crucial and important, whether it is well painted or not. I mean, there are so many important points that one can hint to in a label that is, and we, of course, we would not go to the curator and not yet, at least. So it would be an interesting exercise. I've only started here about 2 years ago, but I wonder whether maybe a curator is open for this. I haven't asked yet. So, but this is a very valuable assignment, I think.
The way I've done this is that I use the Benin bronzes, the so-called Benin bronzes. And this is a genre that a lot of people are paying attention to right now because of the activity around repatriation, the Benin dialogue group and so on. But I have a whole file of Benin labels from different museums that I would be happy to share if anybody wanted to try to replicate this exercise. But I think showing multiple labels of similar objects is very effective to show students the way that curators are making choices, right? We can't say everything. 50 to 100 words is not very long. So, it's important to foreground the fact that, curators aren't stupid. They know more than what they put in the label, but they've chosen to make decisions based on some of those issues that somebody asked about a moment ago, right? That we already talked about a little bit, right? Many curators feel an obligation, if they are curators in an art museum, to speak in certain ways in labels. And that's equally true of curators in archaeological museums, in natural history museums. But with objects like the Benin bronzes, they show up in all kinds of different museums. There's Benin bronzes in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, which actually has, I think, the best labels that I've seen outside of the UK for that material. But those show up in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. They're in the American Museum of Natural History, which has some of the most appalling labels. So putting those side by side really exposes kind of the different cultural frameworks and paradigms that are in operation. So I would really urge that for whatever, it doesn't have to be the Benin bronzes. You could also do it with, you could imagine doing it with Near Eastern palace reliefs that also show up in all kinds of different museum collections.
So one of the things that we do a lot of at the Archaeological Museum is really thinking about co-curation with students or giving students the opportunity to curate their own exhibitions. And the course that I taught that I was just mentioning earlier on a museum practicum course, the idea was at the end of looking at these ceramics that we received, which were primarily Athenian and South Italian ceramics fragments, collected by Avery Brundage, that we would come up with an exhibition proposal for what to do with these things. And you know, going through the course, I think all the students came in thinking that there was going to be a pretty specific way in which one showed things, right? You have things in cases, you have a label, you tell some story, some generic story about being ancient and what ceramics were and that sort of thing. And as we went through the course, you know, the students and frankly, me too, we got so frustrated because there were so many things we wanted to say instead. And it was becoming clearer and clearer that a single label, however long it might be, does not ever adequately tell the story that you really wish you could tell. And we also were reading a fair amount of disability studies scholars and thinking about inclusive design. And that really emphasized for us how exclusionary the kind of glass box of the museum is when things are placed at a certain height, or the type is small, or the light is wrong, or it's too much sensory overload. And you know, this really meant we had to change how we envisioned creating an exhibition. And a lot of them really felt that museum spaces are, they're sort of these silent tombs, right? You go in, everyone has to be quiet. There's a certain kind of decorum expected. And so when we read Marstein's What a Mess about the University Museum as a place of experimentation, and I'll put that in the chat in a second, you know, where she says the whole point of a university museum is to be bold and to try out things that we can't do in, you know, sort of typical museums. The students came up with, I mean, they all had to write exhibition proposals for the end of the course, and they came up with some of the most exciting things I have ever seen. I mean, these sensory things where you would actually learn how to unpack a box, how you would, you know, participate in writing a description of the, you know, the fragments, how you might actually look at the debris from the inside of the boxes as a way of, you know, thinking about the way that things traveled. And I just think, you know, why can't we be more experimental? Why can't we be more honest that a single label is simply inadequate? And we've actually made this way. So why not think about doing things differently to at least try it instead of simply sort of suffering in silence and excluding people in the meanwhile? That's just my thought.
I just want to add one of the comments from an attendee, an anonymous attendee, is that they state, can we at least acknowledge that the writing of a label for a museum display involves a village and often a dozen voices and ends up with no one being happy with what goes on the wall? And they post that as an art museum curator, which I think is a good thing to keep in mind. Like, it does take a village, and it isn't always just one person's vision or their decision making. It can go right up the food chain as well.
That is actually the sad thing, also having worked in a museum and still have an office there, about the history of these label writings within the museum structure, because I also try my students often to encourage to use someone with an individual name as an author, because at least you can engage with this person said this and this. But now this is a question also for museums, because so many emails now are being, I don't know what with my emails happened in the Smithsonian Institution, for instance. I mean, there's an archive there, obviously, when we have paper records and everything. So I wish I hope that my emails, when I was working as assistant curator, also will at one point be available for just others to see how a label is going through a process and how many people are actually involved in this.
I think this is actually a really tremendously significant issue. The fact that most labels are not signed means that they speak with the institutional authority of the museum as a whole, right? They have a kind of anonymous institutional authority. We don't think about, or the general public at least, doesn't think about labels being the subjective opinion of one person or a couple of people. You know, even if it's not just the curator, it's the curator in collaboration with the educators and with, you know, somebody who has veto power over all of them. Sure, it does take a village. But as long as we don't put names on those pieces of writing, the general public sees it as a kind of value neutral statement that has all the authority of the whole building behind it, right? All the marble columns and the click-clackety floors and the fancy names of the whole board of trustee, right? Those all seem to be speaking through the voice of these anonymous labels. And I think that's, in many ways, that's where museums get a lot of their power, is from that anonymity. And that's, I think, one of the things we have to work on dismantling.
So Jacqueline Clements would like us to remember that, or suggest that we develop ways to move beyond the single label or solely labels and start scaffolding on the museum content to allow deeper dives beyond just one label, right? Which I think we would all aspire to, and we would all in our teaching love to think about moving beyond just a single label and to have more of a narrative, as you were suggesting, Liz, either through a biography or now through itineraries, which are also being proposed for lots of objects, but to think more broadly about a single object that would, you know, you could sum up in 50 words or less. Okay, so we have a question here from Marcia, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Anderson, who says, "Hi, I'm a doctoral student at the University of Florida in classics, but I'm also writing the Latin curriculum for Florida Virtual School. I have the opportunity to write in the diversity of the classical world for the state of Florida, along with highlighting this through imagery and material culture. So do you panelists have any suggestions or recommendations on where to access images, catalogs of representative objects to include in the curriculum?" So I would just start and say that one place you could look to is the Khan Academy, right? Is that what it's called? Maybe Liz, I know you participated with them, so you probably know more about them than I do.
That's a great resource. I'm looking at your message and trying to extrapolate from it what some of the copyright issues might be. This is always the $1 million question. But you know, I would certainly advocate, you know, as a good starting point, to reach out to university museums that have collections of excavated objects, right? If this is a Latin curriculum for presumably people who want to learn about the ancient world, then the material objects you want to use for that are ones that actually have a known archaeological context. If you want to broaden it out and talk about reception and you know, the modern history of the classics, then that opens up different paths. But I would urge you to reach out to something like to a place like the Penn Museum or the Kelsey Museum at the University of Michigan. Those are two places that have large collections of objects that, as far as I understand, they're eager to share with academic communities, and where there's a lot of contextual information that would enable you to use those objects to talk about things like daily life in the ancient world.
One thing to add again to, there is this blogger, Following Hadrian is a fantastic source also, because you can really see how the owner of this blog also travels and encounters this emperor and his entourage everywhere in the Mediterranean. So I'm sure that also these individual people who have already been awarded also would be happy to share anything here. And then of course the coins, I think there's a Mantis database, it's called, from the American Numismatic Society, if I'm correct. I forgot, but there's one database also that shares Roman emperor portraits also, which are important, I guess, for introductions into this field. So that's another way.
I think one thing you might want to think about is, you know, what you mean when you're trying to include diversity in the curriculum. I think it's easy to reach for images that kind of, I don't know, fit people's visual concepts of what diversity looks like. And I think that can get pretty tricky, especially when, you know, I mean, you've seen images of recreations of ancient people that have all of these problematic skin tones, and it can get very tricky. I think what I've been trying to do in a lot of my courses is to get at the questions of diversity and privilege and access through different ways. And sometimes looking at the physical objects is, or, you know, reading about people who are looking at physical objects in different ways is really instructive. So one example that I taught in my ancient color course was work done by the British Museum looking at different Roman wall painting fragments, and through their analyses, the scientists were able to show how, you know, wall paintings that were used in areas that were considered elite spaces used more expensive pigments and things that would have been much more costly to acquire and would have come from far away, as opposed to spaces that, you know, would have been primarily for enslaved people are using much cheaper pigments. I mean, this is one way to sort of think about literally who has access to what. And then if you think about more, you know, recent research on these kinds of questions. I think it was the British Center, the Yale Center for British Art that published work showing that, you know, colonial portraits that show both colonists, white colonists and enslaved people in the same portrait, and actually seem to have the same kind of color palette, actually use cheaper pigments in depicting enslaved people's skin tones. So, you know, these are ways to get at these questions of privilege, discrimination, systemic racism that don't sort of, you know, hinge on just, here's a picture of diversity and we're done. And I would just like to say that, you know, I think in this current moment when literally our country seems to be on fire everywhere, or, you know, is in the middle of massive storms, it's really tempting for us, and perhaps it feels good for us to kind of throw in, you know, references to attempted murder or murders of people because it, I don't know, buys us some woke points or something like that. But we should not be doing that, right? I feel like a lot of the ways in which people try to talk about diversity in classroom settings has this real kind of performative sense. And we should not do that if that really has the possibility of upsetting people in our classrooms who simply came to our classrooms to learn something. And I would say, especially for the ancient world, there are, I mean, and I'm saying this as a conservator who has now spent a lot of time reading about classical myths. I mean, these stories are replete with, you know, sexual assault, abuse, subjugation of women, enslavement. I mean, this is hard stuff. We should not stay with the, well, that's what it was argument, right? We should be able to say, these are things that we believe happened or actually happened. These are the kind of ideological things that were put out and that we consume, but we don't need to actually say that we accept these things, right? And I think it's really important to give students a kind of warning before these kinds of topics come up, and also give students an opportunity to opt out if it's something that they just, you know, can't engage with. And I think as an instructor, that's probably one of the most humane things you can do, and really give people space to kind of come to the conversation in ways that are really the safest and most healthful for them.
When talking about the Roman Empire, of course, one of the things, Roman slavery comes up very quickly. So, I mean, you find rarely really depictions, obviously, also in museums of this gruesome aspect of the empire. So Jennifer Trimble had done some fantastic work on seeing Roman slaves also. And so there are very few, but there are images also out there that are striking, and you can show and share and compare them really with what in Florida. Here we have in New York City also a slave market from the earlier centuries where we know where it was actually. So what was in this area, you can compare. The National Museum of African American History has also one stone really that it shows from here in the United States how slavery really functioned there. So I mean, you can compare these, I think, also in some ways, and show the gruesome side of these ancient empires.
All right, I want to be mindful of time, and we only have a couple minutes left, but I want to leave you, the participants, with an action, what to do next, right? Because life is one big group project, as I said, we want to know what you, in your teaching this fall, are going to do to be an accomplice or to decolonize your syllabus. So if you want to put it in the Q&A, that's great, but we want you to really think about this and to do one thing at least to be an accomplice this fall. And this is the way we're going to start. So I'm going to thank everyone for their excellent questions and for this amazing group of panelists. I really can't thank you enough. It was a really interesting conversation. I know lots of you have asked for resources, and we hope to, in the show notes that go along with this webinar, to post more resources. Liz, many people want your Benin bronzes thing, just to let you know, so we'll be asking for that. Michal, is there anything else we should be wrapping up with?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, thanks to everyone for coming and for participating, and thanks to Alex, Sanchita, and to Liz for your amazing comments. I really appreciate your participation. And thanks to the AIA for their support. Thanks.
Thank you all out there.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening.